everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to do some color mixing on this fun Donegal DK base. This yarn is 85% superwash merino, 15% Donegal neps, and the neps in this yarn are a mixture of, I would say, black, brown, and tan. So there's both dark and light neps that show up really nicely whether we're doing a really deep colorway or something that is lighter, which is really fun. Color mixing on multiple samples is fun in its own right because you can create a beautiful fade collection with 25 different colors, but it can also be really helpful practically. Like if you want to get that perfect shade of green, but you only have primary colors in your collection, what proportions do you want to use to get that perfect hue before you scale up and dye enough for a sweater or an afghan or something like that? Now today we'll be dyeing 20 gram mini skeins, and so if you are doing samples for a larger project, you could go much smaller, do even 5 grams or even 3 grams or something like that. You would just then adjust your calculations correspondingly. But today it'll just be fun to set up a square and mix a lot of yellows with a lot of blues until we can create this likely very blue, green, yellow, green, and teal type square. At least that's the goal. Before we jump into the color selection, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Katie G. Katie, thank you so much for being my lab partner and encouraging me to do more color mixing. I am so excited because also one thing I forgot to mention, this Donegal DK base has sort of an oatmeal type color, which doesn't have a huge impact on the final color, like what we saw in the Summer Mini Skein mini-series when I compared this to more ecru bases like platinum. But it could make a difference in the hue depending on the depth of shade or how many grams of dye there are per grams of fiber on the yarn. So if you're doing a different base and you're planning something on a different base, maybe not 25 samples, but it could make sense to dye some mini skeins just to check so that way you know if you want to shift the color a little bit because different blends can absorb colors differently. So Katie, I am super excited to see how this project will turn out, and I really hope that you are as well. I am going to pre-soak the 25 20 gram mini skeins in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. Today we are going to play with greens, and more greens, but starting with two primary colors, Jacquard acid dyes in brilliant blue and bright yellow. And I know from past color mixing with these colors that they actually mix pretty well. In the triangle color exercise, you can see a few different greens in the middle, and they do feel very green. And so while our square here may lean more on the blue or green side, we will see. In my triangle color mixing exercises, every single sample has a total 1% depth of shade, which means that there is an equivalent of 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn total. Here, however, we are going to have different depths of shade, from all the way from a total 0.125% depth of shade to a 2% depth of shade at this end, because we're going to have more and more blue dye across the columns and more yellow dye down across the rows. What this will also mean is that along this diagonal, all of the colors are going to be at a 1-to-1 ratio, just starting more pastel and getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I think what we see will be some light to dark, but also the proportions of these colors will be mixing. The ratios that we're looking at today vary from the most extreme of a 16-to-1 ratio, and then at the most equal we've got our 1-to-1 ratio, and then finally a 1-to-16 ratio the other direction. And so this color will likely be very blue. It may not look very green at all. This color will likely be a very yellow green, or maybe it'll even be fairly yellow. And then here I would say that we're in a green sort of range. I considered having some rows with only yellow or only blue, but really I want to show I guess, what happens with those tiny amounts of color, but still have everything blended. I want to quickly show some of the math on how I calculated the number of milliliters I would need of a 1% stock solution for each of these 20-gram samples. But first, let's do a little reminder of some definitions. The depth of shade is shown as a percentage, but it's the grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn that you use. A stock solution concentration, and specifically our 1% stock solution concentration, is 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of our solution. So a 2% stock solution would be 2 grams of dye, etc. So the way that we calculate the number of milliliters that we need, we look at our depth of shade times the grams of yarn that we'll be dyeing divided by our stock solution concentration. And so that's what gives us this setup right here. And then you can see that the grams of yarn cancel out, the grams of dye cancel out, and then we've got 1 over the milliliters of stock solution. So that's sort of how the units come into play. We could go ahead and simplify this further, but if you're ever concerned if you're setting it up right, bring up the units and try canceling them out. I'm not going to go through these 2 examples, but take a screenshot and cross out the units and double check my math. But I did the calculations here if we want a 0.625% depth of shade to show how much dye we would need, how many milliliters of our stock solution we would need, and the similar with a 0.5% depth of shade to calculate that. And another resource that may be useful for screenshotting, I do have the numbers of milliliters of our 1% stock solutions I will need along the columns or rows, so that way I know how much dye of each color I should add to each jar. So I hope that this is helpful. I could go ahead and make a bigger stock solution, but to make sure that I have enough dye in each of the colors, I went through and just added up 5 times each of these numbers, since there are 5 containers in each row, and determined that I would need about 193 milliliters of a 1% stock solution to set up this entire square. So to make sure there's a little extra in case I mess up, I am going to go ahead and make a 250 milliliter stock solution of each of the 2 colors. While I was measuring out the dry dye powder, I was wearing a P100 respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. To make our stock solutions, I weighed out 2.5 grams of either our brilliant blue or our bright yellow, and then started dissolving this in warm tap water until we hit a volume of 250 milliliters. This time, since we are doing calculations based on the depth of shade, we do want to try to be fairly consistent with our volumes, so that way we have a fairly accurate stock solution. I have set up 25 of these takeout containers I love to use for color mixing, and in each of them I've added 1 cup of plain tap water. I love these containers because it's great for a cool vat, which means that I am going to set up the dye, then add the yarn, then add acid, and let it sit for 24 plus hours. And in that time, a lot of the dye will absorb to the yarn, so that way I can steam set them in batches instead of, say, trying to heat each one of these individually when I have limited equipment to do that. So this works really well. But now I am going to start adding the dye. Starting with the most pigmented yellow at the bottom of the screen, I started adding 20 milliliters, then 10 milliliters, 5 milliliters, 2.5 milliliters, and then 1.25 milliliters of this 1% stock solution of bright yellow to each of the rows. I decided to start with the yellow because you can see a little bit of the depth of shade difference probably in the containers. And once we add the blue, I think it'll be a lot harder to see those differences in the yellow. So that's just why I started in that order. Then for the blue, I again went from the most pigmented to the least pigmented. And again, in the columns, added 20 milliliters, then 10, then 5, then 2.5, and then 1.25 milliliters of each of the colors. As you add the blue, you can see some of the colors shift and bloom, but also they do still need a little bit of mixing before we go ahead and see what we can see before we add the yarn. I haven't mixed things up, and I can say this looks very blue, and I can't really tell how yellow we are down there at the moment because the blue is distracting me a little bit. So I am very quickly going to stir things up, starting at the lightest yellow and blue and then working back through columns until everything is mixed up. There's no acid in here yet, but let's start adding the yarn over with this, I guess our greenest, or well, it's not really our greenest green, but it's our most pigmented color. And this is going to be our bluest color. And then we have our yellowest color, which is still very much a green. But you can see that is a very yellow green. And then here we have a more, I would say a more grassy green. And then up here, this feels just very blue. The yellow makes very little impact there at all. So I would say that this is a really, really nice range for starting with. And I'm gonna need to go get more mini skeins, but figured would add these in. But the nice thing is, since every container has some of each color, that means that the gradients and the fades that we're gonna get are gonna feel really smooth, and there's not gonna be a big jump because from where we go from, say, a little yellow to no yellow or something like that. But I am really excited. I think we could have set things up so that way we might have more, say, yellow at one side instead of just that very yellow green, but I am still very happy and excited, and Katie, I hope you are excited as well. There's a lot of color mixing like this. I want to do more shades with black and things like that, but I know that there were a lot of different color combinations requested, and doing a yellow and blue one was actually highly requested, so I am really, really excited to give this a shot. Now, a question here is going to be, when I arrange this into 5 fade sets, how do I want to do that? Because one obvious one, which unfortunately is only 9 colors, but one obvious one is just to take this outside right there. I mean, that as a fade is so delicious. But yeah, certainly you could do rows, you could do columns, and there's some other ways that we could arrange this too. So I may have fun sort of playing around with this. But what's interesting about this fade, that outside edge that I showed first, is that all of those colors have different total depths of shade. This is a 2% depth of shade, and this is just over 1, and that one's just over 1, with it increasing as we go towards that middle color. And so I just think that that's fun. And then the other thing that is very interesting as we look through all these colors is that along this diagonal, so going this way right here, we have a fade of the same 1-to-1 ratio of all of the colors. So all of these are the exact same mixture, just with different amounts of pigmentation. And I'm sure we could figure out some others that are very, very similar or close as well. But yeah, I'm really, really interested to see how more of these colors shift as we go across rows and across columns. But anyway, besides the time I did this with black and extreme blue, I haven't really mixed two colors. I mean, when I did the black and blue, we were looking at different shades of blue, and this time we're really looking at all of these different green hues, but also different depths of shade as well. I'm not quite sure of the correct terminology, but I know some of you watching who have actually studied fiber arts in art school and dyes and textiles and things like that. Hopefully you can leave us some really wonderful comments as you often do. But ooh, I think I'm going to need to repeat some of these. I think I like I'm enjoying the shifting, the depth of shade and the hue at the same time. I think that it looks really, really cool from what I can see right now. And yay, I had enough mini skeins for everything. I mean, I didn't really doubt it, but you never know. You never know. I really hoped that we would get what felt like 25 different colors, and I feel like we did. Some of these over here feel very, very similar right now, but I have a feeling that they will feel a little less similar as time goes on. Ooh, and I'm interested to hear which you like better, the rows or the columns. And again, there is no acid in any of these containers right now. We are absolutely going to end up with tonal colors because there's not a lot of space for the yarn to move. Things are fairly compact in here, but I suppose I could add more water, but I don't know if I really need to. I think that we're going to get some really, really gorgeous colors. And so look at that. Oh, that looks so cool. Just like with the black and blue, it almost looks like I have a light source over here that is shining on it because of the way that that top corner is lighter than everything else. I think all 25 of these together would make a stunning, stunning project all together. Just working through the different colors. I don't know if 500 grams of yarn is enough. Or certainly you could do like a baby blanket or something. I just think that it would be really, really beautiful to have squares sort of follow this pattern. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous fade. Oh, I really, really like it. So now I think I'm gonna let things sit for, I guess, about 15 minutes. I'm gonna let it sit for 15 minutes and then we can add some acid. It's been 15 minutes and oh, I love, love, love how this is. It is so fun and pigmented. Well, I guess down here, I'm on the pigmented side. You can do something like this where everything is at more of a 1 or I guess a 2% depth of shade where you could even that out. It would just require to get the proportions the way they are, especially with the 1 to 16s that we have over here. To get those proportions right, it would require a bit more math to scale things up, but that would be something that could be interesting to do. Of course, in that case, the whole diagonal would be the same that time. Let's get ready to add some acid. I added 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of the cups and then just gently stirred it up quickly with the edge of that knife I've been using. So that way we have the acid present to slowly allow these colors to absorb over the next few days. Now I just am going to put lids on, which I do have numbered, so I'll be able to put everything back in the same order. And we will check in a couple of days. But actually, I know I've already stirred. To these deepest shades, especially with the blues, I'm going to add a little more acid to just these. Well, we'll use up the acid I have in the cup. Just because, you know, it won't hurt anything. So if things get weird later and I'm like, why did this one absorb but not that one? That would be why, Rebecca. And, you know, remind me in the comments. But anyway, I'm gonna cover them, set them out. I'm actually gonna set them outside where it's really nice and warm, and I'll check in tomorrow or in a couple of days. All right, it is 2 days later, about 48 hours, maybe 49 hours since I first put these outside. Let's take off the lids and see what we've got. Oh my goodness, this is so fun. So once again, we increase the amount of yellow as we go down the rows, and we increase the amount of blue as we go across the columns, giving us our least pigmented color up here and our most pigmented color down here. And this diagonal, they are all the same proportion. It's a 1-to-1 ratio of our green to blue, but just at different depths, total depths of shade. So I guess a total depth of shade of 2, 1, half, 0.25, and then 0.125% depth of shade. And then the area on this side is all significantly bluer. We've got a lot more bluish greens all the way to blue. And this other side is a lot more yellow. The balance is pretty good. But as I did mention before, this one right here is very blue. And that one's a yellow green. It's not yellow, but let's see. That's completely cleared. I'm gonna check these. That's completely cleared. It got to be like 95 degrees outside. So yeah, these are looking good. This one I was a little nervous about, but maybe a hint of color, but things look great. Oh goodness. I think that for steam setting, I'm going to group them by columns. But when it comes to how to set these up as fade sets, I go back and forth. So again, I think that this group of 9 is an amazing set and is something that I might want to go and dye intentionally at some point. And maybe we could add like one more with a little bit less blue, so there's one more, a little more yellow, to have a set of 10. But yeah, so then I'm not sure how I want to arrange the rest. And for Katie, which 10 to send. Because I think that in terms of, if we were splitting this into 5 fade sets, I think that the rows, because the blue changes are a little more dramatic than the yellow changes, I think each row is a stunning fade set. And I think the columns are beautiful fades as well. They're just significantly more subtle. So I'm inclined to group them in rows, but we will play around with this once everything is dry. I decided to group these in columns because the yarn in each column has a similar intensity, because that blue makes a lot more of a difference in the overall intensity of the color. And this way we can try to minimize color transfer between these different skeins as we steam set. But since I was able to set this whole set outside for 2 days where it was 90 degrees, so it was quite warm, that did allow this to have more heat than say if I was having them sit at room temperature inside my home. So there's that to consider. I'm not expecting to see any transfer, but I will probably 10 or 15 total minis at a time, put them in my steamer basket and steam set for 30 minutes. Here is my steamer basket setup, and I've got the 3 deepest sets, which I should remind myself that these 3 deepest ones did have more vinegar than the 2 lightest ones. But anyway, the pot's just getting hot because there's a fair amount of water in it today. But yeah, we'll come back after 30 minutes. And I'll also add that on the 2 lightest columns, there was more contrast in the hue than it looked like while they were still in solution. So I'm very excited by that and cannot wait to see them all dry. All right, it has been 30 minutes and I am going to remove these. Oh, that's hot. Those 3 into a pan and come in with the last 2 to steam set for 30 minutes. Okay, let's see about washing all of this yarn at once. Ooh, I love green. Green used to be, I mean, I think now I talk a lot more about purple, but green was absolutely my favorite color growing up. I'm gonna add a little bit of some clear dish soap. And fingers crossed, I mean, I'm not seeing any bleeding, which is wonderful. I do have 500 grams of yarn here right now. So you would imagine that if we were gonna see bleeding, that we would see it here, but I'm not seeing any. So I'm gonna rinse out the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. But I did realize something. Since this is a Donegal, it's a tweed yarn, if there was color transfer and we got some dark spots from one color to another, it would be more hidden because we've got the speckles from the Donegal in here. So that's just a little food for thought. But anyway, I'm gonna put it through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Katie, this is amazing. I am so excited by all of these shades of green that we have here. And given that every single sample has a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow, I think that the balance that we have is really, really good. As a reminder, we combined from between a 0.06% depth of shade of blue and yellow up in the top left corner, all the way to a 1% depth of shade of both the blue and the yellow, giving us that deepest green down in the bottom right. This means that the combined depth of shade that we have for any given color is between a 0.125% depth of shade and a 2% depth of shade, meaning that the deepest, most green color has an equivalent of 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn. What makes this square really, really fun is that not only do we have different proportions of our yellow to blue on each color, but the depth of shade varies as well. And so if we look along this diagonal right here, these 5 colors all have are all the same color. They all have a 50-50 mix of our blue and yellow. But what they do have is a different depth of shade. So 2%, 1%, 0.5%, and then going on. And so I think that that is really, really fun as an additional comparison here. Another extremely beautiful combination, besides looking at the rows or columns, is this diagonal right here. Because we have both the one that's the most blue and the most yellow, one that's 50-50, and then 2 that are in between. Now, granted, our most yellow color is still very, very green. And our most blue, to be fair, is a little bit more on the teal side versus a quote, true blue. But this is a gorgeous set and would be a gorgeous recipe to mix up again to create a fade set with intent. One other set that would be incredibly fun to replicate would be the most yellow and the most blue. Even though the total depth of shade does vary in each of them, they all feel very bright and intense. And so I think that those 9 work really, really well together. But now I actually have a slightly more complicated problem, because it would be really easy to split this up into 5 sets of 5. I think that the easiest way to do it would either be going through columns or rows. Both of those are really stunning. But the question is, if I'm going to send 10 to Katie, which 10 do I send? And that, my friends, is more complicated. So while I go and twist these all up, let me know down in the comments if you would separate these on columns, on rows, or if you would play around and mix them up even more. Because some of these diagonals, as I mentioned, are gorgeous. It's hard to say if you could create cohesive sets of 5 if you aren't going through rows and columns and using up all of these 25 skeins, but let me know down below. All right, here we have all of the colors. And I think that this would actually be a really fun way to use them. I mean, 500 grams is a lot for, say, a scarf. It depends on the kind of scarf. But this could work for like a nice shawl or something. Or even still a blanket, doing it in stripes this way. But as for the sets, and these sets are going across the rows because I think that they have the most dramatic shift as you add more and more blue. And so what I'm considering is putting these two sets together. And the reason why I am thinking about doing this set of 10 is that I think that we both have 10 distinct colors here, but also they are close enough that you could take these and use them like that. If we were to flip this, that would be another fun way that it could work. You know, there's ways that it comes together. I think that my concern with two rows that were next to each other is that some of those colors feel a little bit closer, but I don't know. Do you think I made the right call or not? Katie G, thank you so much for being my lab partner today, and I really hope that you love your yarn. I always love doing color mixing videos, whether I'm going for a triad and seeing how 3 colors combine, or if I'm mixing 2 colors and seeing the range that you can get from just 2 colors, which is incredible. And I think that this is a handy resource that I will refer back to, but I also hope that it is helpful for all of you. Now, one little reminder, the yarn base that you're using for your color mixing does matter. I used a Donegal DK base in this video, which is not the exact same shade as, say, other bare white yarn. And a, quote, white bare yarn can vary from brand to brand with how much yellow and things are in there. Now, this matters most when you are dealing with more pastel colors. It doesn't make as big of an impact when the colors are deeper. But if you are planning, if you're doing a color mixing exercise like this to plan for a sweater, you want to use a yarn base that is very similar to the one you're going to be using for that sweater as you are working out your shades, because there could be some tiny differences as you go to a different yarn base. So that's worth keeping in mind, but ultimately I think that you would get pretty close. I think that in terms of the depth of color, if I was going from this to, say, a silk blend or something, I might be worried just because silk absorbs color differently and you need more color there. So that is my caution for this, but I absolutely love how this turned out. Please make sure that you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on. While you're at it, give the video a thumbs up. This is the biggest way that you can help support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.